The Dominion had ruled the stars for millennia, an unshakable force that ground entire civilizations beneath its heel. From the moment the Zeltar set their many-eyed gaze upon a new world, conquest was inevitable. They were warlords, slavers, and kings, and their empire stretched across 1,000 systems. No species had ever stopped them. Few had even tried. And then there was Earth, a backwater world in the far reaches of the Dominion's charts, orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. The humans had barely clawed their way into space, and their technology was laughably primitive. Unlike the great empires of the Dominion, Earth had no war fleets, no grand councils ruling over multiple systems. They had no standing army capable of galactic warfare. They had only themselves. Commander Varix watched the holographic projection with barely disguised amusement. The intelligence reports scrolled past in shifting lines of text, cataloging Earth's military capabilities, its fractured nations, its outdated weapons. He reclined in his command chair, mandibles clicking in satisfaction. "This is the great threat," he scoffed, turning his gaze to the officers gathered in the dimly lit war room. "A species that still fights with kinetic weapons? That relies on combustion engines." Laughter rippled through the chamber, the deep, guttural sound of conquerors who had never known fear. "They are primitives," one of his strategists confirmed. "Their history is violent, yes, but nothing that should concern the Dominion. Their greatest wars were fought against themselves." Varix leaned forward, tapping his claw against the projection, where a rotating image of a human male appeared. "And yet," he mused, "there are whispers, stories." The laughter died down. His officers shifted uneasily. "They call him the Baba Yaga," Varix continued, savoring the words. "A myth, they say. A specter that walks unseen. The few slavers who have returned from Earth whisper his name in hushed tones, as if speaking it aloud will summon him." A heavy silence filled the chamber. The Dominion thrived on war. It thrived on crushing opposition beneath an iron boot. But it did not believe in ghosts. Varix exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Superstition. The frightened whispers of lesser beings. It is beneath us." He waved a hand, dismissing the thought. "The humans have lived in defiance of the Dominion long enough. We will put an end to their arrogance. Send the fleet." Orders were relayed. Troop carriers rumbled to life. Weapons hummed with latent power. The invasion had begun. Far below, on the surface of Earth, in the darkness where no Dominion scout had dared to tread, something stirred. The first wave came at dawn. Great black ships descended from the sky, blotting out the sun. Their hulls gleamed with alien metals, their engines humming with energies beyond human understanding. Civilians screamed. Sirens wailed. Cities fell into chaos as Dominion dropships poured warriors into the streets, armored figures marching in perfect, synchronized order. There was no warning, no declaration of war. Earth had always assumed that when the day came, they would see the invasion unfold on their news feeds, debated by talking heads, studied by intelligence agencies. But there was no time for analysis now. The war had already begun. Varix stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the conquest unfold with satisfaction. Earth's defenses were laughable. Human soldiers fell back under the weight of superior firepower. The Dominion shock troops moved with ruthless efficiency, rounding up captives, executing those who resisted. It was all so predictable. Then, the reports began to change. First, it was small things. A Dominion patrol disappeared in an abandoned building. A team of scouts failed to report in. The first deaths were dismissed as anomalies, isolated incidents in a world still struggling to comprehend its own destruction. Then an entire landing site went silent. Varix frowned, analyzing the reports with growing irritation. There were no signs of an organized human counterattack. No mass mobilization of forces. And yet, his soldiers were dying. The first real footage came from the helmet cam of a Dominion enforcer, recovered from the ruins of a military installation. The recording flickered, distorted by some kind of interference. The soldier's breathing was heavy, his pace hurried. Then, a shadow moved in the periphery of the screen. A flash of motion. A strangled scream. The feed went dark. The last thing visible before the signal cut was a human figure emerging from the gloom, clad in black, moving with unnatural speed. The Baba Yaga. The war was no longer predictable. Varex's amusement was gone. He stood stiffly, eyes locked on the cascading reports of casualties, of missing soldiers, of units refusing to advance beyond certain points. Fear was spreading, an insidious poison seeping into the Dominion's ranks. And then, a message. Not a transmission. Not a signal intercepted from human resistance forces. A physical message, left in the blood-stained corridor of one of the captured human strongholds. Scrawled in alien blood, the words were simple. You should have stayed away. Varex's mandibles clicked in frustration, his claws tightening into fists. This was impossible. No single human could do this. No species as primitive as Earth's should have been able to strike fear into the heart of a Dominion force. And yet, it was happening. The humans had nothing. Except him. And for the first time in his long, illustrious career, Commander Varex felt something cold and unfamiliar settle into his bones. Doubt. The Dominion had never known fear. They were an empire built on brutality, their conquests absolute, their enemies left in ruin. Planets did not resist them for long. They crumbled under orbital bombardments, surrendered to the weight of inevitable defeat. No world had ever made them hesitate. Until now. Varex stood rigid in his command chamber, watching the latest reports unfold in cold silence. His invasion had begun like any other, overwhelming force crushing an inferior species, shock troops sweeping across cities with ease. And yet, in the hours since their landing, something had shifted. The humans were not responding like other conquered worlds. There was no desperate attempt at negotiation, no frantic offers of surrender. Instead, there was silence. Entire units had gone dark, vanishing without a trace. Patrols sent to secure urban centers failed to report back. At first, Varex had dismissed it as human incompetence. Perhaps the fools had detonated their own infrastructure in an act of self-sabotage. But the bodies were never found. His soldiers did not die in explosions or firefights. They simply disappeared. And then came the first real sign of something wrong. A transmission, recovered from a Dominion officer's armor cam, played on a loop before him. The footage was shaky, blurred by rapid movement. The officer's breathing was ragged, his voice frantic as he muttered prayers in his native tongue. A shadow moved in the periphery. The officer swung around, weapon raised, but there was nothing there. Only the distant flicker of lights in the ruined cityscape. His breathing quickened. The weapon's muzzle trembled. Then, from behind him, a whisper. A guttural sound, low and inhuman. A single word in a language he should not have understood. Run. The screen cut to static. Varex's claws dug into the console. This was no ordinary resistance. This was no rogue militia fighting a hopeless war. Something hunted his men, something unseen, something that struck before his soldiers even knew they were in danger. He had fought countless campaigns, wiped entire species from existence. But this was different. He turned to his second-in-command, a towering brute clad in crimson battle armor. Enough of this nonsense. Deploy the purge squads. Burn everything. I want this creature's head mounted on my wall. The order was given. The Dominion would not be mocked. The city burned. Fire rained from the sky as incendiary strikes reduced entire blocks to ash. Dominion warriors moved in formation, armored hulks marching through the wreckage with weapons drawn. They tore through buildings, dragged humans from hiding places, executed those who resisted. Streets once filled with life were reduced to silent graveyards, bodies left in the smoldering ruin. And yet, the killings did not stop. For every human executed, a Dominion soldier was lost. No one saw it happen. No one heard the attacks. They only realized it when they turned and saw the absence, an empty space where a warrior had stood just moments before. The purge squads faltered. The hunting parties hesitated. Some spoke of whispers in the dark, of shadows that moved unnaturally, of a presence that watched from unseen places. Fear crept in, slow at first, then all-consuming. And then, the first survivor was found. A Dominion captain, once known for his cruelty, was discovered wandering the ruins of a military checkpoint. His armor was intact, his weapons still in hand. But his eyes were vacant, his breathing shallow. Varix loomed over him, studying the defeated thing that had once been one of his finest. What happened? The captain did not respond. His mandibles trembled, his hands twitching as though warding off invisible specters. Varix snarled, seizing the captain by the throat and lifting him off the ground. "Speak." The voice that answered was barely a whisper. "He's real." Varix's grip tightened. "Who?" The captain's dead eyes locked onto his. "The Baba Yaga." The word sent a ripple through the gathered officers, a quiet shudder of unease passing through the room. It was just a name, a human ghost story, something meant to frighten children. And yet, Dominion soldiers were not children. They did not fear shadows. Until now. Varix released the captain, letting him crumple to the ground like discarded waste. He had no use for broken things. His mind whirled, rage simmering beneath the surface of his calm exterior. He had to end this. Quickly. Decisively. Before the infection of fear spread. He turned to his fleet commander. "Seal the city. Lock it down. If anything moves, kill it." The order was swift, absolute. No human would leave. No human would hide. The Dominion's dominance would be restored. But the killings did not stop. One by one, the executioners became the executed. The hunters became the hunted. Something moved within the burning ruins, something that did not fear them, something that did not stop. It did not fight with armies, did not rely on weapons of war. It struck with precision, with patience, with an inevitability that made even the most hardened warriors tremble. The bodies were found strung up like grotesque warnings, armor shattered, weapons left untouched. The marks on their throats were not from energy blades or projectile fire. They were made by hands. And then, the message came. A single transmission, broadcasting across every Dominion frequency. No distortion. No encryption. Just a voice. Come. Steady. Human. You should have left us alone. The screen cut to black. Varix stared at the darkened console, feeling something he had not felt in centuries. Not anger. Not hatred. Something far worse. Doubt. The silence was worse than the screams. Varix had known war for centuries. He had led planetary invasions, commanded fleets that darkened suns, crushed rebellions before they could fester. He had stood on the smoldering ruins of civilizations and listened to the dying cries of species that no longer had a name. But never had he experienced a war like this. His soldiers no longer moved with confidence. Their steps were hesitant, their eyes shifting to the corners of the ruined city as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Their weapons, which had once fired with ruthless efficiency, now trembled in their grasp. The great Dominion war machine was not built for fear. And yet, it was everywhere. They had locked down the city, sealed every exit. There was nowhere for the humans to hide. And yet, the losses continued. Squads patrolling the streets would suddenly stop responding. Reinforcement units sent to investigate would find only abandoned weapons, helmets cracked and left in the dust. There were never any bodies. Just the lingering scent of death. The whispers had spread. It started as murmurs among the lower ranks, hushed voices speaking of something unnatural in the ruins. Officers executed those who spoke too loudly, but it did not stop the rumors from spreading. The men spoke of a ghost, a demon that walked unseen, a force of vengeance clad in the shadows of a dying world. They said the humans called him the Baba Yaga, the last executioner of a dying species. Varix had dismissed it at first. The Dominion did not fear myths. But myths did not leave warlords dangling from streetlights, their chitinous exoskeletons shattered, their weapons untouched beside them. Now, even his officers hesitated. He stood on the bridge of his command ship, staring at the tactical display. The city stretched before him, a glowing grid of ruined infrastructure and failing defenses. His fleet hovered above like a predator ready to strike, but brute force had failed them. His commanders awaited his order, but none dared to speak. Varix exhaled slowly. This ends now. His voice was steel. He would not let this illusion of resistance fester. The humans were weak. The humans were broken. And whatever phantom walked their ruined streets was just a man. A single order flashed across every Dominion screen. Full mobilization. No survivors. Asterisk asterisk. The Dominion swept forward like a tidal wave. Streets that had once been ghostly quiet now echoed with the thunder of armored boots, the hum of high-energy weapons. Soldiers stormed through buildings, clearing each room with mechanical precision. They burned hiding places, dragged humans from underground shelters, executed them before their families. No more slow suffocation. No more patience. It was over. And then they heard the first scream. It came from the north sector, where an entire platoon had been advancing in formation. The scream was cut short, replaced by a sickening crunch, the kind of sound that bones made when something much stronger snapped them in half. A Dominion officer issued commands, his voice firm despite the rising tension. But no one responded. The platoon was gone. Vanished. Another scream, this time from the east. A sniper team positioned on a rooftop reported movement, shadows flickering between broken buildings. They fired into the darkness, confident, precise. And yet, in the next breath, their voices were silenced. Another patrol lost contact. Another. Then another. Varix watched the reports come in faster and faster, his mandibles grinding together. This was impossible. His forces were sweeping the city in synchronized waves. No resistance force, no matter how well trained, could cut through them like this. But this was not resistance. This was slaughter. A new transmission appeared on his screen, a live feed from one of the soldiers' helmet cams. The trooper was breathing heavily, his weapon scanning the empty corridor of a burned-out building. The feed was jittery, distorted, but something moved in the darkness ahead of him. A shape. A man. The soldier fired. The round sparked against concrete, shredding the walls, but the shape was already gone. A flicker of movement at his side. Too fast. The camera jerked as the soldier spun, his breathing now frantic. His rifle swung wildly, but there was nothing there. Then, a whisper. Come. Steady. You shouldn't have come. The screen cut to static. Varix clenched his fists. Enough. He turned to his fleet commander. Burn it. All of it. If this thing hides in the ruins, then we will leave no ruins to hide in. The order was absolute. From above, the Dominion fleet adjusted its weapons. The bombardment would begin. The city would become ash. The ghost that haunted his forces would have nowhere left to hide. The Dominion did not fear the dark. But as the first missiles locked onto their targets, as the fleet prepared to erase the city from existence, a single message appeared on Varix's console. A direct transmission. Unencrypted. Unstoppable. His blood ran cold as he read the words. You think I'm trapped in here with you? You're trapped in here with me. And then, the lights flickered. The command center was silent. Not the silence of discipline, but of dread. The Dominion fleet hovered above the ruined city, its warships poised to deliver annihilation, but the order to fire never came. Varix stared at the flickering display before him, his claws tightening against the console. The message remained on the screen, its meaning sinking deeper with each passing second. You're trapped in here with me. Something was wrong. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows across the bridge. The usual hum of the ship's systems wavered, a heartbeat stuttering. A minor power fluctuation, perhaps, except Dominion warships did not suffer malfunctions. Not unless. Varix turned sharply. Status report. A technician hesitated before responding, his voice uneven. Minor disruptions in. The lights died completely. A breath of darkness, deep and absolute, swallowed the bridge. The Dominion command crew froze. Warriors who had never known fear now stood rigid, their hands tightening around weapons that would do nothing against the enemy they faced. The emergency systems flickered to life, casting the room in a dim crimson glow. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. Then, the alarms began. Not the sirens of battle, but something worse. Isolated distress signals. Ship by ship, sector by sector, Dominion vessels were going dark. This is the Bloodrend. Something is inside the transmission cut to static. The Vartak just lost primary engines. Silence. One by one, warships that had brought ruin to entire worlds fell silent. Not to weapons, not to battle, but to something inside them. Varix turned to his second-in-command. His voice a sharp hiss. Deploy the elite guard. Sweep every deck. The order was relayed instantly, but it did not matter, because it had already begun. The first screams echoed through the corridors of the flagship. The bridge crew barely had time to register them before a Dominion warrior stumbled into the command center, his breathing frantic, his crimson armor darkened with something wet. "Gone," he gasped. "They're all gone." Varix stepped forward, towering over the trembling soldier. "What are you talking about?" The warrior's mandibles quivered. "He's here." Something moved in the darkness beyond the door. Not the heavy, measured steps of Dominion forces. Not the mechanical whir of security drones. Something quieter. Something deliberate. A shadow flickered in the dim emergency light. The soldier who had spoken turned too late, his eyes widening as his body jerked suddenly, violently. A wet crack filled the air, and then he was gone, dragged into the darkness as if he had never been there at all. Weapons were drawn. Energy rifles charged. Varix felt his own pulse quicken, though he did not allow it to show. A voice, smooth and cold, drifted from the black. "You should have left." Then the killing began. The first shots lit up the room, streaks of energy cutting through the dark. They struck nothing. The shadows moved, reshaped, swallowed their prey whole. One by one, the Dominion's finest warriors fell, their weapons useless, their armor offering no protection. Varix fought with the fury of a warlord, his twin blades flashing, slicing through the air in deadly arcs. He struck at shapes that dissolved before his blows, fired rounds that hit only empty space. The bridge was a slaughterhouse, his finest warriors cut down like vermin. Then, for the first time, he saw him. A man. A human. Clad in dark armor, his face shrouded in shadow. He did not move with rage, nor with desperation. He moved with certainty, a predator among prey. Varix lunged, his blade carving through the space the man had occupied, only for the human to sidestep, fluid and effortless. A strike to his wrist, sharp, precise, sent the blade clattering to the floor. Before Varix could react, a hand closed around his throat. Pain. Not just from the strength of the grip, but from something deeper. A realization. This was no myth. No ghost story whispered in the dark. This was death itself. He struggled, his massive form writhing against the unbreakable grip, but it was useless. The human leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You thought you could break us." Varix gasped, the edges of his vision darkening. "You thought we were weak." The grip tightened. "But you didn't realize something." Varix felt his strength fading. The warlord of the Dominion, the butcher of 100 worlds, brought to his knees. The human's final words were barely audible. "You invaded the wrong planet." The last thing Varix saw was the abyss closing in. Then, nothing.